Welcome to A-List Talks with Adam Armbruster. We have a phenomenal guest today, Mr. Stephen J. Pruett. You probably know the name already, but just in case you're new to the media industry, he's executive chairman of Cox Media Group. His prior leadership posts include Sinclair Broadcasting Group, Communication Corporation of America, DirecTV, Thomson Consumer Electronics, and more. Steve brought a master's in management from the Kellogg Graduate School of Business at Northwestern University. He's also an author, and his upcoming book is called Gain Principles, Helping You Master the Art of Life's Growth Cycles for Career and Personal Development. What a great title, and how relevant is that today? Phenomenal. He lives in Atlanta with his wife, Paula. And Steve, it's great to have you today.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Let's just jump right in, okay? Steve, what's a word that describes how you would want people to know you?
I think accessible and open-minded to new ideas.
And I would agree so far that that's my perception of you as out here. It really is, Steve. Where was home for you as a child? Where were your early years?
My parents, so I started out in Arkansas. I lived with my grandmother a great deal of my childhood because my parents moved north to get factory jobs. And so then at about 5, I went to live with them during the school years and attended school in Southern Illinois, right outside of East St. Louis, which is where I grew up. And but I spent every summer with my grandmother, who was my biggest influencer as a child and young, even till I was in my teens, on her farm in Arkansas. And but really Southern Illinois, St. Louis area, East St. Louis area was where I started my adulthood.
Sounds like a real all-American start. Farm, factory jobs. I come from similar background. Just starting where you start, right? You grow
Right.
where you planted.
Didn't know what I didn't know, to quote my friend David Smith. But it was very good. It wasn't bad. It just was what it was, that my parents were shift workers. As soon as I was out of school, I was on the train with my, the early years with my older brother, from St. Louis. We'd take the train down, the two of us. He was, he would have been 12 or 13 and I was 6. And, away we went. Grandmother would pick us up in the Newark. They say Newark down there, Newark. It looks like Newark train station. And we'd start our summer off. She'd take us to the movie, and then we'd off to the farm. We'd go, and then from then on it was town once a week. And there were a couple different little towns we would go into for her to get stuff. But what I realized when I was really thinking about how I grew up and thinking about things that influenced me, what I realized was that my grandparents literally made their life. And I had never really thought about it, that, what I ate and drank came from my grandmother's farm. My granddad was, he had a sawmill and he cut timber, and my guess is they had homesteaded some acreage when they probably got married in the early 1900s. And they had grown that little homestead from 40 acres to 140 acres. And then they had bought some bottom land, which was cropland that wasn't adjacent to the homestead. But my grandfather would cut trees off of this river bottom land, and he would get a chance to sometimes buy the land for the taxes. And my grandmother would use money she made from her little livestock operation. And I mean, it was a one-woman show, which I followed her around everywhere she went. Life didn't stop for her because I was with her. She had chickens to feed, hogs to slop, cows to milk. And that went on from about 4 in the morning we'd see my granddad off, and we would start. And I thought that was the coolest thing, and that is the way I've been ever since. It's, it starts, it always, my life started about 5 in the morning, my whole life, and it went on until, it was done, and then fell asleep. So, and she used to tell me that, I wanted like store-bought stuff, and she would take fresh milk and put it in a store-bought container. She'd get a half gallon, and then she'd refill it with what I called cow's milk. I said I didn't like it when I was a little kid. She said I couldn't tell the difference. I'm not sure I buy that 100%, but you know, everything we ate and drank pretty much was, except for when we went into town to Batesville, Arkansas was the main town we went to. Newark was much smaller. Batesville was bigger, meaning it was probably 3,500 people. And Newark was about maybe 1,000 people at that time. And we'd go to Piggly Wiggly, and we would stop at the Dairy Queen, and before it was called DQ. And that was, when I got, we got to have a Dr. Pepper or whatever. And so that was, really, and I went to visit her I lived with her every summer until I was 15, and I got 16, and I got a car, and I still went to see her all through my young adulthood, 4 times a year. And, eventually my parents kind of moved back down that area when they retired. And so I'd see them too, but she was the pivotal influencer. And it was a feeling that she had the confidence to do things, and, that were both, would have been daunting to a lot of people, whether it was, slaughtering chickens, anything mechanical on the farm, and she did, she picked up the feed, and she did all of this. I mean, and she did odd jobs too off the farm. Like my cousins down the road had peach orchards, so we'd all pick peaches. And, we all did these. There was no stigma to what you did, to what they needed to have cash money, right? They were we have TV shows today about people who live off the land.
It's cool again.
And yeah, and she had I would say a 1-acre garden, and we worked in that constantly, from spring till fall. And she canned everything. If it could be grown, she could can it. And even like, she had this thing called mixed pickle, which was just odds and ends out of the garden, squash, at the end of the year. And she would grind that all up and put some, spices in it. And that was mixed pickle. Onions and tomatoes, and, whatever the last of the crops were would get canned that way. And then all year long, she was canning. And I mean, she'd wait in, we would go out picking wild blackberries and things called muscadines, which are kind of a grape. I mean, not if, well, you gotta watch out here. There might be a water moccasin in there somewhere, but it was like game on. And I had, she was probably 4'10" and 100 pounds dripping wet. And, that was who I learned from. And, my granddad, I didn't spend as much time, because he didn't want me around the sawmill, because it was incredibly dangerous. When I finally got into my teens, he let me work there. As long as it wasn't in the main building, I could stack lumber and shovel sawdust and do stuff like that. I mean, there were so many ways to get killed in a sawmill, that he wasn't going to let me in there. And so that was really what taught me about, I think, relying on yourself, and hard work pays off. And I saw my relatives down there all address different kinds of opportunities that came out of their hard work. And, many of them became small business people. And, then other people like my parents left to go become union workers and factory workers. And so I grew up in this idea that, working for a company was okay, but it was also okay to be on your own. And that's probably what kind of formed a lot of my thinking about life. When it came time, I felt, when I had to try to support myself, um, that's really what formed the way I went about it, right? Is like, oh, if I work hard, and then if I can find something somebody will pay me more for, and if, I can get something and I can sell it, or I can make something and I can sell it. I tried all kinds of crazy things when I was young. And that's what kind of led me, that was the formation of how I launched.
What a terrific beginning. Just idyllic farm, all-American story. That's remarkable. Steve, what pulled you, what was the earliest memory while you were growing up of being called in a direction? I mean, you clearly ended up in media via other companies, corporations, but do you remember the first one, the first time you said, I think I want to be doing that?
Yeah, in high school, I dated a girl down the road, and I had to drive by this little tiny radio station in Columbia, Illinois. And I know now it was a Class A FM, and the guy had it, and he mostly it was that part of, as you went south from where I lived, um, with my parents, it was a lot of big farmland, and it was a lot of German people. So they played polka music, and they played the local, it was all local stuff, and we'd all kind of make fun of it, But I was really intrigued by this little building, this little brick building, and the guy was making radio, and I kept thinking. Of course, I was really into radio as a teenager and listening to music on the radio. I listened to KSHE radio out of St. Louis, which was the progressive rock station. Is what we called them back then, and plays the same music today, and it's called classic rock. So they just never changed anything in 60 years. So that was, like, wow, you could have a radio station. Some guy had that radio station. And then when I got into high school, I just remember that it was on my mind, and it was intriguing to me. And as I went to Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville on a track scholarship, and mainly I was really interested that they had a radio TV. They had an actual RTVR program, and I signed up, went to school. My first couple of years, I took as many electives as I could. I got way behind on my required studies, but I got a job writing for the school newspaper, and I wanted to cover bands. I mean, what would 18-year-old doesn't want to cover bands? And I met a guy there that was a photographer, and he had a magazine called Concert News, and he hired me basically for gas money to like write articles, because he was a photographer for the Post Dispatch. So his view of the world was, I'm going to print pictures I take, and but I need somebody, and I don't have any money. So he got guys like me, kids, young men and women, and we wrote articles. We had a great time. And then through that, I was doing interviews, and I met somebody from KSHE Radio, and they liked the interviews I was doing. And so they hired me to as a part-time DJ, and to kind of cut up these interviews and use them on radio. The radio station I grew up listening to, not the one I passed in my car, but this one was out of St. Louis. And so there I worked behind Ronnie's 66 Drive-In, similar little brick concrete. This building was concrete block. The one I'd always driven by was a little brick building, but this one was concrete block. And it sat behind Ronnie's 66 Drive-In. and the KSHE was the alternative station. Alternative, before they had the name alternative, it was called Progressive Rock. It was owned by Howard Grafman, and it was he and his brother had a company called Century Broadcasting. They had 4 or 5 major market stations, and his brother, well, Howard, I worked for Shelley. Shelley was the brother. Howard was the founder, and Howard started Century music syndication, Beautiful Music, and they would bicycle these tapes all over the country. So you could have an FM station, and you could just rack up a reel to reel of like that soft elevator music all day long, and that's how they really made their money. The rock stations, I don't know that they were the big money makers. They eventually sold them, but that was my introduction to radio. I'll never forget, probably talk about formational things. There were a lot of people who helped me, and there were people who resented me or didn't accept me. And I'm trying to remember the guy's name. So this gives you an idea what I remember and what I don't remember.
Yeah, who helped
Can't
you,
remember
Steve?
his name. I want to think it was Rick something, but he was the general manager of the station, and he didn't like that Shelley had hired me to do this. Shelley had been the one that met me, and he was the owner's brother, part owner, and had me doing this stuff around the radio station. So Rick made me clean. One day, he made me take everything off his desk and wipe down his desk. And he stood over me while he made me do that. And it was really humiliating. But I did it, and then I went back and got to go in the production studio. I mean, I interviewed people like Fleetwood Mac, Bob Welch when Bob Welch was in the band, and Mick Fleetwood and John McVie, and I later interviewed Stevie Nicks and uh, uh, can't think of Buckingham's name, but
Lindsey Buckingham.
Lindsey Buckingham, and then I got to interview Freddie Mercury and Frank Zappa, Lowell George. I mean, I just interviewed all these incredible people, and I was 18. I didn't know, proverbial from Shinola. I didn't really know anything, and but I got to meet these people, and they were, they were normal, right? They weren't, they were just professional musicians, right? When they were in the radio station, well, they wanted airplay, obviously, and then KSHE was the radio station. So I can't, it's just a long list. Patti LaBelle, people that I got to go see, and later, and then in there I worked part-time for a rock promoter. So that was, a young guy, a guy named Chris Fritz. I just looked him up on LinkedIn the other day, still around. Chris hired me to work for him to drive money and tickets around. He was out of Kansas City. And so I was very fortunate, people that just saw an energetic kid willing to do about anything, and they hired me to do stuff. And back then it was just a different world. It didn't seem like the barriers were quite as tight for getting in on things, right? And but so I think one of your questions was people that made you feel bad. That was that guy. And then I can't remember his name, but I can remember Hal Prodder, who was a longtime broadcaster. He was the general manager at Channel 11 in St. Louis. And my boss had hired me, my first TV job, Clark Grant. And the general manager, God, I can't remember. His first name was Ralph. So Hal was a person who, and I mentioned this in my writings, Hal was one of those people that once I met him, he stayed my friend and supporter for life. And he never abandoned me in my harder times. I met him at a community ascertainment meeting back in those days. We used to have to do those. And it was one of those jobs nobody wanted to do. So they sent me, the new kid. and the lowest person they could find at the TV station. And I went and I ran into Hal, who was there as general manager, and he had to run the ascertainment because you had to report these things to the FCC. And he talks to me for a while, and Hal was different. He never looked right at you. He was always kind of looking up and kind of daydreaming. And he goes, would you ever, oh, I remembered Ralph's last name. He goes, would you ever think about going into sales? And I said, oh, you'd have to be at least 35 to go into sales. I was 21. And he goes, well, you go tell Ralph, that was the GM. He goes, you go tell Ralph, I'll put you in sales. And so I didn't tell Ralph. I told Clark that I had a sales job offer, and I think he was jealous. And because I had seen the salespeople at Casey, and they had nice cars, they had they dressed nice, they got to come and go, and so I thought that looked attractive to me, and so I went over to work for Hal, and it was the draw, which I didn't know what a draw was. The draw was $150 a week. This was in the 70s. So, I mean, that's not terrible, right? That's pretty much the equivalent today times 10, 1,500 a week. That would be what that would be today. And but the commission rate was good. The commission rate was like 10%, 15% on direct business. And so I became the yellow page dog. I mean, if it was in the yellow pages, and then later I got better at it, and I started going after the Post-Dispatch Sunday paper, and I'd find somebody. I made these storyboards. Okay, we didn't have computers, so I'm old, all right, but we didn't have computers, so I had the art department make up a storyboard, and I'd find people who had a double truck, a 2-page color ad, and then I had them drop 4 weeks of TV screens, and I put all the shows on them. And my pitch was, I would go in and I would say, here's $3,500 a week. This is what you're spending on this double truck ad. And you're missing this kind of repetition. If you give me one double truck ad, the equivalent of one double truck or one half of one double truck, I'll get you 4 weeks, called a retail impact plan. I'll get you 4 weeks of TV. And I sold those things like they were going out of style. And so pretty soon I was making $4,000 or $5,000 a month, and within a year. And that was a lot of money then. And so that went on, and I did that for a while, and that was my thing, local, direct. And I never forget, I'd go into these places and the owner would typically be in there. I went in to Slyman Brothers Appliances, and I sold them a retail impact plan. They became one of the biggest TV advertisers in St. Louis, and Harry Slyman. And, that was just the way things worked. I was lucky. I don't think I was that smart or that good, but I was persistent. I once asked David Smith why he chose to partner with me on my business when he already had a TV group. In fact, at the time, it was the largest TV group. And he looks at me and he goes, I was waiting for something like good. I was pumping him, David, you're not going to get a lot, right? He goes, persistence. And I said, really? Persistence? And he goes, yeah. He goes, there are a lot of smart people that don't make it. And there are a lot of really talented people that don't make it. But he goes, most persistent people make it. And he goes, you've got persistence. And that's true. So, Hal was one person, was my friend for life. Later, when he was distribution head of WB, he helped me put together Acme Television. That was 15 years later, 20 years, I don't know, maybe longer. It was in the 90s. So it was at least 20 years later. He helped me orchestrate buying KPLR, the station we both worked for, from Ted Koppler. Ted wouldn't have sold it to anybody else but Hal. So the station I started at as a yellow page salesperson, I was able to circle back and put a group together to buy that with Acme Television for $138 million 20 years later. And I dealt with Ted, and Ted was always super kind to me. He came to my wedding. He was the owner. His family was incredibly wealthy. They owned it, the huge real estate developers in Missouri and in the 50s and 60s and 70s. His father and a lot of people were massively wealthy people, but Ted was just Ted, and he treated me really well. My friend Brian Brady, who's incredibly successful and really the founder of this company, he founded it by selling his company Northwest to Apollo, which then bought CMG. A lot of people, nobody really focuses on that or knows that story, but that's how the company was founded. And Brian has been everything with me from, I hired Brian as a salesperson at one of my stations when I was building stations in the 80s. He went on to start his own company. He's far more successful than I am. But he's my biggest fan, advocate, and supporter, and has never wavered in 30 years, more than 30 years. Yeah, well, at least since the 80s. I've known him since the 80s. So, so there have been more of those people than less. I think one of the questions on the list was, what's the worst thing anybody ever said to you or something like that? I've got some good ones, but Chris Ripley once said to me, and this really kind of hurt because I had recruited Chris to Sinclair and when I was there, and he went on to, and I had supported him becoming CEO. David asked, and I didn't really want to be CEO of Sinclair. So I was at a different point. I always have been more entrepreneurial. I really, wasn't seeking a C-suite job, but I don't know, we were disagreeing over something. And Chris said, people think you're bombastic and hyperbolic. And he gave me a book called The Ego is Thy Enemy. And I thought, wow, okay, that's probably true. And so I read the book, and it turned out to really help me. And so while it was painful, I give Chris credit for saying it. I mean, a lot of people won't tell you, right? I don't know. It didn't seem particularly mean-spirited at the time. I don't know what he was trying to prove, but at the end of the day, it helped me. And then I've since given that book to other people.
Is it possible, Steve, that, and I've always thought this, I don't know, I'm asking your opinion. Is it possible that other people see holes in you that you don't see? And I don't mean holes in a negative way, just things that you want to be better at. Is that possible?
Oh, my high school English teacher, who really thought highly of me, wrote in my high school yearbook, your life is destined to be a series of ups and downs because you leave yourself so wide open. And that's still true.
In terms of vulnerability, in terms of you're an open book, you clearly are.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my wife, who's way savvier, my wife worked at NBC and was successful in her own right, ran our TV group our first TV group. And she always says, you can't trust this, you can't trust this other thing, you got to look over your shoulder. And I said, I don't want to be in a foxhole with people that are going to shoot me in the back. And I just don't care if that's the case. And I mean, I've got knives. I did almost 8 years at Sinclair. I got knives in the front, knives in the back. I've got wounds all over the place. David was the kind of leader that he feels you need to be able, and I would tell him this if he were sitting here, you need to fend for yourself. If you're not good enough to fend for yourself and win, then you're probably not good enough to do your job. And, I see the logic in that. Now, on the other hand, David gave me massive opportunity that paid off for me in a big way. And he treated me for better or for worse, like a brother. And he thought of me that way, I think. He thought of me on a personal level as a talented person who had some holes. And, he was going to give me the platform to learn how to fill those.
What do they say when
Um,
you're playing little league? It's when the coach stops pulling you aside and talking to you. That's when you should worry,
yeah,
right? It
right,
hurts when you're being coached. I'm not perfect.
right.
Turns out I can improve, but when they stop talking about you, that's probably the worst thing to happen.
Yeah. And when it came time to leave, he didn't really want me to leave, but I think he was intrigued by this opportunity as I was. We talked about it. I told him it was a funny story when the first time I met Apollo, it was to take them to dinner with David and I and Brian Brady. And I said at that dinner, I said, David, these guys are going to try to recruit me if they can buy these stations. And he goes, well, we'll see how that goes. Right. And then he and I had lunch once a month to talk about, like, are they going to make you an offer? And, we talked about it for 9 months before the offer came. And it was that kind of relationship. And at the end, he wanted me to stay. He didn't like it that I was leaving, but he supported it in the end. And he's still my friend. And um, if I needed something today and I was in big, big trouble of some kind, that's one person. I call Brian, I call David for sure. Hal passed away, so I can't call him. Um, and my Aunt Ellis, who worked for me, she was like my sister. I would call her. I mean, there are a few people that I know I could call no matter what, right?
So
And
it's it kind of iron sharpens iron. I mean, you grow as an executive, right? And you've sharpened some people too. You might do it a different way, but this is how it works, right? There isn't
well,
like a coaching class.
I never meant to be an executive. That sort of came. I was more of an entrepreneur. I was really a salesman, and I found a really good product to sell. I sold money. And once I started raising money, which was really selling money to, I'd get a client, I'd get a deal, and I had the sources, and I would put that all together and I'd take a commission. And I did that for 15 years. Some things I kept an ownership in, some things I didn't. I was more like a real estate developer than an operator. And then wanted to start operating at some point. And in there, I had that little foray of Thompson and DirecTV were one thing. They both hired me 50-50 to manage joint ventures for them. And they had 17 joint ventures, which I ended up shutting down all 17. And because they were not good partners. And so in there, though, I got a glimpse of corporate life in these guys. I worked this guy, Eddie Hartenstein, and a guy named Steve Cox, that was the general counsel and of DirecTV, and then a guy named Frank Danjard, who was the co-director general of Thomson, the French company. And I'll never forget, I interviewed with this guy in Carmel. It's not Carmel, it's Carmel, Indiana. Carmel, Indiana, where their headquarters was. And I'm interviewing with this guy. And I said, well, like, where are you from? Are you from Indiana? He was so taken aback. He's French, but he didn't have a trace of an accent.
Really?
Yeah. And then he broke out in French. I think I had insulted him, but he hired me anyway. And
That's
he
a
was
good
really
story.
smart. He and this other guy had taken Thomson from being a government company to being a private for-profit company, or a privately owned company, and they had killed it. They had really done well. So I learned, I was able to get in front of people and hold my own. And somewhere in there around 2000, I decided and I'd done a bunch of entrepreneurial stuff. Some had worked, some hadn't. And I didn't, I was seeing a change where an independent hired gun like me was going to be outflanked by, you know, the banks were coming into broadcasting, the big banks, the big investment banks. I found myself competing with Alex Brown and, bigger and bigger companies to do deals. And well, in the 90s, I had gone to work for Communications Equity Associates. Rick Michaels, Bennett, was an incredible person to me, still is a friend to this day. And he is really somebody I respect and idolize for just pure energy, but smart, done extremely well. It treated me extremely well. Gave me a huge opportunity where I made a bunch of money basically by him providing the back office, right? And again, it was basically commission sales. I was making 100. I went there on no guarantee. And about 9 months in, I said, look, I'd like to get something. He was covering my expenses. So they gave me 10,000 a month. And that was in the 90s. And I was kind of in another rebuilding mode. And so I just killed it for the next, 6 years. And I commuted from Phoenix to New York and Phoenix to, we had an office in LA. And so I went back and forth. So I was somewhere. So I traveled 20 plus times to LA and 20 plus times to New York a year from Phoenix. And that's how I got DirecTV as a client. And then that's how they ended up hiring me directly. And, but I had a lot of clients during the time. We did really well. We built Acme Television from nothing, from a piece of paper. Bill Lysecki, who was my partner there at CNA, he and I each put in a check for $300,000 to buy a UHF station in Portland, Oregon. And we guaranteed the losses, and we didn't have the money raised. And the losses were like 100,000 a month. So we gave ourselves 6 months to raise the money. I don't know what we were thinking. Oh, it was definitely that. And we raised $3.5 million from friends and family at CEA, passed the hat round. And then Brian McNeil from Alta Communications, who at that time was a big PE guy in broadcasting, came along, and I think he put in 15 million maybe, as I recall. Then, and we just kept going out and signing up. Like, to quote Hal Prodder, he came to my house. I had left the business. He came to my house. He goes, look, I know you can raise money for dog stations. And I'm like, well, Hal, thanks. But I said, that's getting harder and harder. I said, you can't go out and raise $2 million anymore, $3 million and borrow some money and start a station. He goes, well, he goes, I've got all these WB stations and they're all a bunch of dogs and they're all running out of money. And I said, well, I got an idea. Let's put a bunch of them together and raise a bunch of money. That we can do. And we did. And CIBC raised a bond for $250 million. And then about a year later, we took it public, and that 300 I put in then rolled into the 3 million as $3 for one, and then it rolled into the public offering for a bigger number. And then that really was, a big comeback for me. And we ultimately sold, Acme was very successful. I got out before it sold. Jamie Kellner unfortunately passed away. He was one of our partners, and Doug Geely unfortunately passed away. He's one of our partners. They owned it for a long time, built it up, and that was when WBs and UPNs were going to be the big thing, and eventually became CW. So I was around all of that at that time, and then, like I said, around 2000, I started thinking, well, maybe I want to go in a company and operate it. And I probably veered way off the questions. I'm trying to remember.
No, please stay on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, because now you're arriving current day. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So, um, in 2000, I went and I said, I want to find a company that's highly leveraged, and I want to go in a high level and fix it because I know I can. I know debt inside out, right? And so I found these guys in Louisiana, Tom Galloway and Wayne Elmore, and they were leveraged at about politely 8 times, really probably more like 10 times. And so I called them up. I'd taken them on a golf trip to when I was at CEA to Ireland. And I called up Wayne and I said, hey, I know your guys' debt's got to be coming due with Chase. Can we, why don't you hire me to fix it for you? And so I worked for him. So he says, no. He says, we got that handled. Well, in September, the planes hit the building. And I'm sitting here and I'm going, I wonder how those guys are doing. So I called them back and they're like, I think we're in trouble. Because, I mean, it was probably in November, December, I called them. And, things were messy. And I said, I still believe, I think I was the only guy. They ran around, talked to everybody. I think I was the only person that said I can fix it, right? So I went in there in 2002 as a consultant. And Tom was this very exaggerated Southern gentleman, Colonel Sanders looking guy. He made a lot of money wheeling and dealing radio stations and TV stations. And the reason that they had borrowed a lot of money was they had paid themselves a massive dividend, and they had levered the company to the rafters. Company was a good little company. It just needed to be repackaged. And that's when I really started in earnest working out troubled. I had worked out some of my own deals. And, you always, when you do deals and you're an entrepreneur, sooner or later, you get in some kind of difficulty. We've all been there. And so Tom calls me up and he goes, Mr. Steve, he says, would you come down here and be our CFO? And I said, well, Tom, it's really not what I do. I'm not a CFO. I'm a deal guy. And he goes, well, we want you to come here as CFO. And he goes, we'll pay you what we pay ourselves. And I'm like, I know what that number is, so I'm going. And they gave me some equity. And I went in there and Agnes Levy. So she was the workout person at Chase Bank. I don't know where she is today, but I was going to be tough. Like, Wayne was this real tough guy, tough talking guy from Alabama, been a banker. He liked tough talk, right? So I was going to emulate Wayne. I call up Agnes Levy. And I start in with her, kind of on a tough level. And she goes, listen, I got Wayne Elmore to keep me in the dark and feed me bullshit. I don't need you too. And I'm like, oh, so what do you want? And she goes, here's what I want. She gave me a list. And this kind of thing had followed me throughout my career, where some person who everybody thought was tough and mean and hard said to me, like, let me tell you what I want. And if you can get that, we'll cooperate. And Lissa Miller, who was a buyer at Coke at McCann Erickson when I first was a rep, they sent me over there because she was the dragon lady. And I went in there and I started the same way. I was going to be tough. And she goes, sit down and listen to what I'm going to tell you. She goes, they sent you over here so I would chew you up. And here's what I'm going to do. Your station's going to get 20%. Here's what you're going to give me for that. And stop talking and go back to the office and write up this order. And I was a hero. And so she had turned the flip. I was caught in a game I didn't understand, but I was naive enough and open enough to say, well, okay, I'll go with this and see how it works out. Agnes Levy did the same thing. So what she wanted me to do was go out and get a commitment to take out the Chase loan. Funny story, Apollo was also an investor in this company. They had the sub debt, and it had accreted way past the value of the company. So I had to redo that debt, and they were very straightforward. I won't say they were easy to deal with. They ended up owning half the company, but I navigated this whole thing, and I reformatted the debt and reformatted the company. Then eventually I got the commitment letter. Agnes played ball, got a deal done, not with people I got the commitment letter from, but with GE Capital. And down the road we went, and we got it done. And then 2 years later, got in a fight with the lender group, and they tried to extort a bunch. I won't say extort, that's not the right word. They tried to squeeze us. And Tom Galloway comes in, he goes, Mr. Steve, would you take us through a bankruptcy? And I said, well, Tom, here's the deal. I'll lead you through bankruptcy, but you and Wayne have to sit on the sidelines. I'll get you some kind of a role, and I'll get all your real estate out, and you'll walk away from this thing pretty well, and I'll be CEO. And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what I got done, and took it through a bankruptcy in Louisiana, which was an education. And because while it's federal bankruptcy laws, the judges are still Louisiana judges. And so, that's how I learned how deals come apart. You don't know how to put a deal together till you really know how to put one together till you know how it comes apart. And bankruptcy is a PhD in that. And because there's rules, but there's no rules. In other words, there's rules of conduct and there's rules of materiality in bankruptcy. But the judge he can decide, and he can say, listen, you're going to take this and you're going to take this, and you're all going to get together and you're going to do this. So these guys, all these hedge funds that had bought our debt, flew in to bankruptcy court, and the judge says, first of all, they thought I was making too much money, so they said, well, we want to cut Pruett's salary in half. And the judge looked at me and said, Mr. Pruett, how much money do you make? And I said, well, not really sure. And I really couldn't remember. I mean, it was complicated. And he goes, what do you do every day? And I told him. And he goes, what do you think about every day? And I told him. And he goes, he hammers down. He goes, I think Mr. Pruett is, bang, motion denied. Mr. Pruitt's going to do just fine with me. So these guys, this goes on. These guys fight us every tooth and nail, every step of the way. Finally, the judge was on a Friday, always on a Friday. Everybody's flown in their private jets, all these hedge fund guys. And the judge says, we can't get anywhere. He goes, I'm going to lock the doors to the court. You're going to stay here all weekend. And when I come back on Monday, you better have a deal. And you're going to eat out of the vending machines downstairs. And one of the hedge funds had a black jet. And he goes, he looks over at those guys and he goes, you're not getting on that little black jet and going back to New York for the weekend. And because it was a black jet, and he knew it. And so he was savvy, and our pitch was, company was fine financially. The company we could pay our interest in full. We just couldn't pay these big penalties that they tried to levy against us. And one of our biggest helps in bankruptcy was the Apollo guys, because they took a haircut and made the deal. And this partner there, I've never talked to him since, and he's been incredibly successful, but he just looked at it and said, these guys are the ones screwing us, not you. And so we're gonna, make this deal. They'll help you make the deal.
What a great journey, man. There's some business lessons hiding in that story. I don't know if you
Oh,
even though you
I tried not to make the book. I tried to make the book sort of a like, think about this without too many war stories. Some war stories. Think about these things. Think about the things that inspire you or lead you to something. But all of this happened in very distinct cycles. My growth really happened, and certain events led to that growth along the way. And the way I think and the way I act was forged by some fortunate and some unfortunate incidents, right? I lost my youngest son when he was 20. That made me rethink how I wanted to show up in life. Lost my oldest son 4 years ago. He had been born with a congenital heart defect that had, he lived to be 35, which, he could have died the day he was born with what he had. It was, major open heart surgeries and reconstruction. And he lived a great life. He toured the world as a musician and was successful. And he, but again, you reassess how you want to show up and what you want to think about. And for me, that last part was really a part where I said, I think I do want to write about, because people would ask me, how did you get where you got? And I always emphasize, I am not the most successful. I'm not even the most successful of my friends. I mean, I maybe that's something. I mean, people I'm friends with in business are far more successful. People that I've worked with, Mark Burnett, Dr. Phil, David, Brian, on and on. I've had the blessing to be around, to see in person, to do business with. If I felt anything other than like, for them, then like, I'm really glad these guys are successful. I don't think it would have gone the same way. If you feel jealous and competitive with those people, you don't get anywhere with them, right? And when you see a talent like Mark Burnett give a pitch, or you see somebody like David Smith, like I did, day in and day out for 7 or 8 years, really and truly, I met with David June 20th of 2011, and I worked for him for all practical purposes almost from that day. I formally went to work in January 13, and I was there till August of 19. And he was amazing. He is amazing still to this day. Hard to understand sometimes, personality wise, but incredibly insightful, almost what I would call psychic at times, like with how he could read a room. And I've got some real funny stories. We'll go into them today, but some other time, about different situations we were in that where his insight and intellect and also his attitude was very, very interesting. But I've been blessed to be around these incredibly successful people. And like, I'm the poorest of all my friends. So
You know what they say, don't have the biggest house in the neighborhood, don't be the
yeah,
richest of your
I'm
friends.
the poorest and least successful. And even my rivals, are most of my rivals are more successful. But I can't, I got more than I ever thought possible. I didn't even think I didn't know this world existed. Right?
Steve, your book, I can't wait to read it. by the way. I'm going to say the title again for those listening. Okay, so I get the title right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Gain Principles, helping you master the art of life's growth cycles for career and personal development. You can count me on your read list. I'm going to make sure I get a copy of that. Steve, I want to read a quote from you. I don't know if this is in the book or not, so I want to make sure that we wrap up on this, please.
Okay.
I'm going to read your own quote to you, and I want to ask you what you mean. Your own quote, Steve, is this: there's often a perception that executives are somehow different, operating on a separate plane. But in reality, most executives are just people who genuinely care about their teams and the success of their organizations. Steve, what does that mean to a young professional listening to this as we wrap up?
Oh, I think, boy, I could, there's a lot of things it means, but the fact is, don't forget that that person that you think of as being maybe iconic or whatever is just a person, right? They have kids, they have problems, they have families, they have wives, they have brothers and sisters, parents. They think of those things. That's most I've met almost no one that I can remember that was so clinical or so cold that they didn't have that aspect in their life. And that oftentimes in a business situation, we forget about that. I learned Bill Armstrong was a US Senator, that again, another person who took me under his wing. He owned some radio stations back in the day. He sold them, I think, I'm going to say he sold them in the 80s or 90s. Did very well. Incredible guy. I went to see him one time. We were doing something, I can't remember, maybe trying to borrow money to buy a radio station or something. And he'd hired me, and I went into a room. And before anything started, he went around the room. I took all these investment bankers in to see him. And here's what we're sitting. I think it was probably purposely at the Senate, some office, Senate office building, in a conference room. And he went around the table and he asked each one of these guys about themselves. And there was a bunch of these young guys, the type that, investment bank goes somewhere, there's two partners and four guys carrying bags. And these young guys they're really smart and they're working hard, right? And they're just, I now know they're sitting there worried that there'll be one typo in their pitch, right? And they didn't know what to say to him. They didn't know if it was like, he goes, "Hey, well, tell me about yourself." And he was this real downer guy. He's a very wealthy guy, by the way, made a lot of money in radio. And before he went into the Senate in service of the country and in his mind. And he asked, and we didn't start the meeting until everybody talked, and changed the whole dynamic of the meeting. So what I mean is that was, for me, a PhD in accessing, although it was the reverse, right? That person that everybody was there to pitch turned the tables and showed his humanity. You want to know about their mom, where they grew up, their dad, whatever they wanted to talk about for 5 minutes, right? And he'd allocated 20 minutes to go around the table, 3 to 5 minutes each. But I think that's when I say that is, if you remember that, if you can think about that, and you look across at that person and you imagine them in that instance, your energy will change, whatever you're trying to do, and your true energy will show through, right? Like if you're talking to this person and you think of that person as a father, your energy will shift. If you're trying to pitch a business concept, I'm a big believer that the energy. I watched Mark Burnett give a pitch once, and I mean, literally, I felt it change. It was unbelievable. And the pitch in particular was a show he hadn't done yet called Messiah. And he was telling us the story in David's conference room of this. He just signed the deal. I think it was on Netflix to do these shows. And he told us the whole thing. And it was the whole room shifted. Everything. I mean, the energy, everything. So that's something. Don't forget that. In the way you can access that is to look at that person and try to think of what is their human side. What are the things that they're dealing with. So that's a short answer.
That's a wonderful conversation. Steve Pruett, thank you for joining us on A-List Talks. I hope the young professionals listening to this and all professionals take away some of Steve's lessons. I picked up a few along the way. So Steve, thanks for being with me today.
Well, don't be afraid to reach out. That goes to anybody listening. I answer all LinkedIn's, even if it's to say I can't answer it, but I at least acknowledge the request, and I'm here to help. So that's how I want to be seen the rest of my life.
Steve, thanks for joining me today on A-List Talks.
Glad to be here.